in the Harness: Stories, Solutions, and Strategies for Safe, Satisfying Driving. This podcast is all about working animals in harness, from agriculture to pleasure driving to performance driving at the international level. Learn about what driving is, training tips, history, and more with each episode. I am your host, Corey E.R. Trout of CERT Horsemanship. In this episode, we are going to be discussing open versus closed bridles. And we're going to start with the question: what does it mean to have a closed or an open bridle? A closed bridle basically just means you are restricting the horse's vision in some way. An open bridle means that the horse has no vision restriction. So in the case of an open bridle, the horse, donkey, cow, or mule has its full natural vision at its disposal. Riding horses are almost exclusively worked in open bridles, except in some racing disciplines, and even then it depends on the individual animal. So closed bridles restrict vision in some way. The items that we use to restrict the vision are called blinkers, winkers, or blinders. I often joke that the more important an item is, the more names it has in driving, because there are so many parts of the harness that have multiple names, and the blinkers are no exception. So the blinkers restrict rearward vision and often the side vision of the animal as well. It basically eliminates the peripheral vision, and there are multiple reasons why we might want to do this that will be discussed later, but essentially the closed bridle has some type of blinker that reduces the horse's vision. This can be as extreme as dropping the horse down to its limited binocular vision, which the majority of the animal's vision can be used and they just can't see behind the bridle cheeks. There is a variant of blinker that are called can't see backs, and those also just restrict the rearward vision. Some can't see back blinkers are a shaped cup, and others are simply a fuzzy or padded tube of fleece or some other material that goes over the cheeks of the bridle to block the rearward vision. Some animals prefer a can't see back type closed bridle to one that has full blinkers, but it still has the effect of preventing anticipation of the whip aids, which we're going to get into in a minute. My personal preference with a closed bridle might seem a little oxymoronic, but I like to provide as much vision as possible. I try to keep my blinkers set as wide as the blinker stay allows, and I know some people will put theirs super narrow and the horse doesn't have much vision to speak of, but my preference is to give them as much vision as possible. And for me personally, and this is driving according to Corey, I don't want the animal I'm driving to anticipate my whip cues visually. This is why I use closed bridles. And I don't use them with every animal, but hear me out here. The reason I used closed bridles with some animals is to avoid them anticipating my whip cues. If you've done any amount of work with a whip, sometimes, the lash gets tangled and it's twirled around the shaft and you have to untwirl it. And that has nothing to do with what you're going to be asking the animal to do. And you don't want them anticipating an action just because the whip moves a little in their peripheral vision. So if I have an animal visually reactive to a whip, I want to move them into a closed bridle once the basic training's done, because I don't want them anticipating that just through the visual signal. I want them to feel for where I'm going to touch them with the whip and not anticipate the whip's movements through its visual field. So animals that anticipate visually tend to be go-getters and very forward. Any movement of the whip is often interpreted as a go faster cue. This isn't true for all, but if you have a horse that is this way, and we'll call it visually hyper-responsive to the whip, a closed bridle will help make them wait for the physical cue of the whip rather than just assuming what it's going to ask them to do off of the whip's trajectory. So I have a fun little story to go along with this concept. I worked with a really cool, sporty, athletic miniature horse mare, and she was on the hyper-responsive to whip visually side. She was a little reactive overall to start, but she wanted to do the thing and get the right answer. She didn't want to get in trouble for missing a cue, so she was a little anticipatory. I helped her owner start her in harness, and we drove in an open bridle at the beginning, and I could definitely feel as I drove her, when the whip would move, she would pretty much be asking, go right, go left, go faster. And anytime that whip was moved, I could feel the shift in her body as she prepared to make a change that she assumed the whip was definitely going to demand of her. So she was waiting and ready for anything I asked her to do. We did shift her into a closed bridle for a couple of months because feeling her kind of, twitch between the shafts wasn't the best thing. That because she could no longer see it, she was no longer anticipating it. Now, a couple months later, because the owners had multiple minis that drove, and they weren't quite the same size, so in order to get the bridle to fit both the driving minis, they actually had to change out the crown piece of the bridle. And they had taken the older mare to a show, and they hadn't changed the bridle back. I'd gotten there to work the younger mare again, and instead of taking the time to change out the crown pieces, for the amount of time we had to work with, I didn't feel like it was necessary. And being as that she had been started open and driven that way already, we went ahead and drove her open that day. I think this was about 3 months after driving her in the closed bridle, so we had a good amount of time in which she hadn't been open, drove closed, and it was really funny because the whip anticipation had completely disappeared. The time she had spent in the closed bridle learning that the whip only means something when it touches her transferred over into her working open a few months later. I couldn't feel that shift in her body or the shift in the cart anytime I moved the whip around anymore. That was really cool and a unique experience I've yet to repeat with another animal. But she was probably one of the most whip anticipatory animals I've worked with thus far. So it's just a good example to me about how even just spending some time in a closed bridle can help the horse go open again down the road. It doesn't always have to be, you put the animal in a closed bridle and it's in the closed bridle until the day it dies. You can go back and forth depending on the individual animal. And were reasons for being in a closed bridle. And I just talked about my personal biggest reason is whip reactivity. And that can also apply, so we've been talking about single animals. If you're in a pair, and a lot of times in a pair, you have an animal that is the go-getter and then the other one that's a little lazy. Well, you don't want your go-getter assuming, as they are wont to do, that the whip is going to be for them when you're trying to get your lollygagging one to step up a little bit. So it's not just as an individual horse thing. If you're in a pair, it prevents one of the horses from anticipating a whip cue that isn't actually for them. Some people will say that one of the reasons they use a closed bridle is it helps the horse focus better. And for some animals, this seems to be true. This falls under the out of sight, out of mind concept. So they only focus on what they're actually seeing instead of other extraneous stimulus, visual stimulus it is. Now, if something is making a noise, a lot of times they will still crane their necks to look around and see what it is. Some of them, if they're hearing noises without saying something, that'll make them nervous too. So it's not always true that not having the visual stimulus is going to prevent them from reacting to something going on. But that said, for anything that's purely visual, if they can't see it, it doesn't bother them. The next reason, and this one makes pretty good sense to me too, if you think about it, the vehicle sits within the horse's peripheral vision or in the edges of it, and it moves in and out of that space. Horses have 320, 350 degree field of view, depending on who you talk to, and basically they can see from hip to hip. They can't see directly behind their hip bones, but they can see everything else. And obviously they do have that blind spot directly behind their tail, and they can almost eliminate it just by turning their head to see past their hip bones. So they also have a blind spot a couple feet in front of their nose, but that doesn't really apply to the closed bridle. Anyways, they have a really wide visual field, especially when you compare it to a human. And, we're lucky to have 180 if we can see straight out to the side of our heads. The other thing the other thing about horses is they do not have a lot of binocular vision. So obviously binocular vision is when you have two eyes by. Monocular is when you just have one. Horses have a lot of monocular vision. We have a lot of binocular vision. So we have a wide swath of binocular vision, and each eyeball has X amount of vision, and then we have a very wide shared field of view in front of our heads that allows us to judge height, distance, depth, and so forth. So this is essential when you're a predator or you're an animal that has to move through trees and other obstacles and have to care about how far away things are as you move around and pass them so you don't, trip over something or run into something. Horses developed in large open spaces and don't necessarily need to see super well how high or far things are because, the plains are flat or they change really gradually. So they have a wide field of vision and most of it is monocular, which has limited depth perception. But also, horses have about half the visual acuity the average human does. We say we have 20/20 vision. They have about 20/40. So how sharply focused we see things 40 feet away is about what the horse sees at 20 feet. Also, when you're driving, you have the vehicle and everything sitting behind the horse's butt. When they turn, especially in a four-wheeled vehicle, they might see a little bit more of the vehicle that's behind them, but they're seeing it out of the corner of their eye. You have something that's moving in and out of the animal's peripheral vision. If you have ever been sitting and doing a task, whether it's, sitting at the computer, reading a book, whatever it is, and something is moving in and out of your peripheral vision, you can understand how distracting or concerning that can be. Let's say you're reading a book and something's moving around in the corner of your eye. You're going to turn your head and look at it to get a better view. The same thing can happen to the horse. It's also important to note that horses are way more sensitive to movement than we are. They may not see as clearly, they may not see as many colors as we do, but if something is moving, the horse knows it's moving. They can see the movement even if they don't know exactly what is moving yet. With the vehicle moving in and out of the horse's peripheral vision, and you have the whip moving in and out of that space as well, you have things that can trigger a fight or flight response. Or if the horse does spook at something else, it doesn't matter what it actually spooked at. There's this big thing behind them shifting in and out of their vision, and oh my gosh, that's now after me, they might think. So the idea behind a closed bridle is it's there to prevent distraction of things moving in and out of the peripheral vision, but it's also there to prevent the spook reaction from shifting onto the vehicle that is attached to the horse. So that's, apart from the anticipation of the whip cues, that's the other big reason why you may wish to work in a closed bridle. Now, the case for open bridles, and most people cite this just simply as basically allowing the animal to see things. If you have your full vision, you can see better, and that's the simplest way I can put the argument. For me, again, it depends very much on the individual animal. I have noticed with oxen that they are pretty much exclusively driven open. I don't think I've ever seen a picture of a ox, cow, what have you, wearing a closed bridle. Someone can get me a picture and prove me wrong, but I have not seen oxen work with restricted vision. My own postulation is the positioning of their ears more to the side of the head puts them almost in a blinker position. So, they can't necessarily look behind if their ear is kind of in a normal relaxed position. If they pull it back, obviously it increases their field of view. But anyways, also cattle are a little bit more prone to stop and stare first before buggering off away from something that bothers them than a horse is. Donkeys and mules, in my somewhat limited work with them, they also tend to like seeing more of what's going on, and a lot of them go better open as well. A lot of them will go fine closed, but they seem to prefer having their greater vision. I believe donkeys tend to not see quite as well as horses do. And I also think this is why traditionally mules tend towards a more pigeon wing style blinker. which also gives them more forward vision and blocks the rear view. If you've never seen pigeon wing blinkers, they kind of do look like a bird wing, and the fat part kind of goes along the cheek, and then the pointy part angles back towards the rosette on the bridle. And it just kind of blocks that rearward vision. It gives you a little bit more towards the front. So in many places in Europe, you'll see a lot more open bridle uses. Well, back in 2022, I got a book on traditional draft work with horses in Germany, and just thumbing through it, there was one picture of a horse with a closed bridle on, and everyone else was open. And so I found that really interesting in that context. And of course, it was agriculture related. If you're doing logging and stuff, allowing the animal to see where it is, especially in dense areas where there's a lot of obstacles, having that full vision can definitely be a benefit. I also want to note that as far as the American Driving Society is concerned, for competition rules, there is no rule against the style of bridle. You can drive an animal open or closed. Any animal can drive open. It is up to the individual driver. You do have to put a bit in your animal's mouth, and if you are bitless, you would have to talk with your local organization about that if you're competing in a local level show. But open bridles are allowed, full stop. If you have an animal that drives open, you can drive open in ADS competitions, and that covers both the United States and Canada. Now for breed shows and fine harness stuff, I do not know what the rules are for open versus closed bridles. I assume it would very much depend on the individual governing body you are working with, individual breed organizations or show committees. So check with your organization for the event you want to enter if you aren't sure. I also know that for the North American 6-Up Classic Series, they don't have any specific rules written down. They don't have a physical rulebook, so technically, as long as it's safe and controlled, you can go in there bitless, barefoot, and open. They might look at you funny, but it technically isn't against the rules. You probably wouldn't be placed very well, but it's still possible. You can do it. So going back to me personally, open versus closed bridle, it's up to the animal. When I do training, I do everything open first anyway, and then if there's signs that the animal might do better closed, or even if the client wants to drive closed specifically, after going through all the initial training steps, I will then move into the closed bridle and repeat everything to be sure the animal's fine with that. But I have had some animals that don't care one lick one way or the other. They'll go open, they'll go close, exactly the same animal to drive, no matter what. And then I've had others that very strongly prefer to be open, and some that very strongly prefer to be closed. Up to the individual. They have their preferences, and if you listen, they will make them known. To me, any animal that is happy and comfortable in its work is the safest one to drive. So for many things you're looking at, what your animal is most comfortable in, how they best respond and move in, and just work in accordance to its preferences. So I have heard people say that I would never drive a horse closed. I've had people say I will never drive a horse open, and they give their long list of reasons, but to me it's whatever the animal's comfortable in. If it works better closed, closed bridle. If it works better open, open. Now, other considerations on open versus closed. I do have a video about this, but with an open bridle, similar to a riding bridle, you can go without a noseband. My preference on driving bridles is that it needs to have a noseband because I want a gullet strap, and that requires a noseband to function. What is a gullet strap? Well, a gullet strap is a strap that runs from the throat latch to the noseband, and it allows you to be able to snap a lead rope onto your horse because it'll have a little ring underneath the chin. Snap a lead rope onto your horse so you can lead it by the bridle if necessary, or you can tie it, whatever. But the other thing it does is it also makes the bridle more secure on the horse's head because it pulls that throat latch forward. Even with an open bridle, I want the noseband for the gullet strap. You don't have to have a noseband with an open bridle, but again, referring back to the gullet strap, I like to have one because nosebands allow you to use gullet straps. And it's also nice to be able to have your horse tied, hook up, unsnap, and away you go. On a closed bridle, you always want to have a noseband. Please have a noseband on your closed bridles. Why is that? Why do we need a noseband on our closed bridles? They sell closed bridles without a noseband, but it's not a good idea. Why is this not a good idea? Why would I sit here and argue with somebody who sells driving bridles and may even sell a lot of them, but don't buy one without a noseband? Why? Why is it not a good idea to have a closed driving bridle without a noseband? Well, I'll tell you why. The reason you want a cavesson, also called noseband, on your closed bridles is that it should be designed in such a manner that it prevents the blinkers from being pulled away from the side of the horse's face. And I've got another story for you. I had a discussion with a client recently about adjusting her bridle, and she had talked about how tight it was on the horse's head, and she went ahead and dropped the cheek piece as a whole. No big deal, right? The bridle fit better, the horse was calm, all good. And as she was driving along, I wasn't with her at the time, she was out driving on her own. Every once in a while, he got a little spooky and weird. And overall, he was fine, but then they made a tight turn, and he did a little, butt tuck and was very concerned, and she didn't understand why, and then she realized that she could see his eyeball behind the blinker. She had dropped the upper part of the bridle that was holding the blinkers in place, and now it was low enough that the horse could see behind it, and it wasn't just that the horse could see everything, it was that it could see it in little snippets. So for the most part, he went great, but every once in a while he would catch something in his peripheral vision, and that concerned him. So we went ahead and readjusted his bridle. We shortened the upper buckle back up to where it was, and we dropped the lower portion. So on a driving bridle, whether it's open or closed, you have 2 adjustment points for the length of cheek on your bridle. You have one on the crown, which is how you adjust where the blinkers are in relation to the horse's eye, and you have one down by the bit, which allows you to adjust how high or low the bit is in the mouth. So you have 2 points which you can adjust the length of the bridle on the horse's head. Once you get your blinkers adjusted, you don't want to touch the top one. Unless you've got a really young horse whose head is growing, like a 3-year-old draft horse who's definitely going to get wider between the ears in the next couple of years, they're typically not going to grow from eyeball to eyeball, over the ear over the course of time. So once you get that set, you have the eye centered in the blinker, you can call it good. Then if you change your bit, if the post is higher or lower, or you move on to just a half cheek, you adjust the bottom end of the bridle for length and fitting it to the head. So that little story aside, this is why we have a cavesson on a closed bridle. The job of the cavesson is to prevent the cheeks of the bridle from being pulled away from the side of the horse's face. Sometimes what happens when you engage the bit is that it moves the cheeks of the bridle. I'm sure you've probably seen this on a riding bridle too, and this also applies, bitless as well as bitted. But sometimes what happens when you engage a bit is that it moves the cheeks of the bridle. This isn't just caused by a strong lateral aid. So, when you pull on your rein, if you're pulling sideways, yeah, that can cause the bit to move away from the horse's face, and it can cause the cheeks to move away from the horse's face. But it is also, when you pull back on the reins, the bit moves up in the mouth, and it moves closer to the horse's crown, and that will cause the cheeks of the bridle to pooch out away from the horse's face, and that's just the way it is. The cavesson on the nose should attach in some way to the cheek in front of the blinker, and that prevents that part of the bridle from moving out. So you'll still get a little portion between that connection point and the bit that will pooch out or bunch up, but the cheek of the bridle that holds the blinker shouldn't move out away from the horse's face. This is a safety thing. As I mentioned in my little story, if the horse is playing peekaboo with the things that are behind it, it can make the horse nervous, especially if you've got field of vision, a blank spot where you got your blinders, and then suddenly they can see just in their peripheral vision. So at minimum, if you've got something moving in and out of the peripheral vision, it can be distracting. At max, it can be frightening. So again, depends on the individual horse, but we want to be sure that if you are working with a closed bridle, have a cavesson on your bridle and be sure that your blinkers can stay flush with the horse's face and aren't being pulled out to the side. So always, always, always with a closed bridle, you want a cavesson on it. You will see bridles out there without full cavessons. Sometimes you'll see just an upper nose band on some of the work style draft harnesses, or on some of the fine harness bridles, you won't see a nose band at all. You'll see something that kind of looks like it, but it's actually the overchecks going over the nose. The designs of the overchecks on these type of bridles could potentially mitigate some of the outward pull on the bit, but it does not prevent the cheeks moving out as the bit moves up in the horse's mouth. It could be argued if your horse is checked up high enough with an overcheck, there is no place for the bit to move upwards in the mouth, only back against the jaw, but that is another discussion entirely. So when you are fitting a bridle to your horse's head, you want to be sure that the eye is, and you're using a closed bridle. So when you're fitting a closed bridle to your horse's head, you want to be sure that the eye is sitting centered in the cup of the blinker. And it is a little bit better to go too high than too low. Too high, and the horse ends up with more forward vision, which isn't really a bad thing. But if you get it too low, it goes back to the problem of the animal playing peekaboo with things behind it. They have their forward vision, a blank area, and then a spot behind that they can see out of. And that can cause troubles. So regardless of your decision, open versus closed bridles, as I said, it depends on the individual animal. I mean, I guess there's some human preference involved also, but to me, leave it up to the animal you're driving. I hope you enjoyed this and learned something new. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at easyintheharness@gmail.com. If you wish to support this podcast and other educational content, please go to our Patreon at patreon.com/certhorsemanship. That's CERT horsemanship. It will also be linked in the show notes. Being a supporting member gives you early access to the podcast episodes and transcripts. Higher levels of support give you access to videos, diagrams, and more that I have to offer, covering subjects from harness fit and function, vehicle selection, maintenance, and training your horse to drive, as well as more. This episode was produced by Amara Saldate. And remember, you have freedom when you are easy in your harness.